and welcome to a study of the Gibeonites in the Bible. I suggest reading Joshua 9 and 10 and 2 Samuel 21 before reading this, as reading those will give you a better understanding as to what I will be talking about. If you truly want to go deep, I recommend reading Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 20, and Leviticus 19 as well. Who were the Gibeonites? The Gibeonites were the people from the city of Gibeon, and are descendants of the Hivites. The Hivites themselves are descendants of Ham's son Canaan. They are first mentioned in the Bible in Joshua 9:3, which states, "And when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done unto Jericho and to Ai." The city of Gibeon was located in ancient Palestine, northwest of Jerusalem. Next we will go over the archaeological evidence for Gibeon. As you may see above, that is a picture of the Pool of Gibeon. The Pool of Gibeon is mentioned in 2 Samuel 2:13. The pool itself was unearthed in 1957. The Pool of Gibeon, one of the world's most remarkable engineering achievements, was dug 88 feet into limestone until it met the water table. A spiral staircase along the walls allowed access to the water, according to the archaeologists that excavated the site. This is some helpful information to know as we go along. Moses in Deuteronomy 7, 1-4 is commanding the Israelites to be aware of tolerating the people living in Canaan. The people in Canaan must be destroyed and taken out of the land. This may seem extreme, but there were reasons for this. The reasons are listed below. The people in Canaan deserved to die for their sins. Deuteronomy 9, 4-5. The people in Canaan persisted in their hatred of God. Deuteronomy 7:10. The people in Canaan had the potential to bring idols into Israel. Deuteronomy 17-18. They were not to make covenants with the people in the land of Canaan for the reasons stated above. As for those outside of Canaan, Deuteronomy 20:9-11 shows how the Israelites are to treat them. What happened before the treaty between the Gibeonites and Israel? Joshua had become Moses' successor in leadership of Israel. The Israelites recently had two major victories over Jericho and Ai. News on the conquest of these cities spread through the land of Canaan, causing kings on the left side of the Jordan to gather together so that they may fight against Israel, hoping that their cities would not be destroyed. Joshua also made his main encampment at the city Gilgal. Now we will get into the Gibeonite deception talked about in Joshua 9. Joshua 9, 3-6 states, "And when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done unto Jericho and to Ai, they did work willily, and went and made as if they had been ambassadors, and took old sacks upon their asses, and wine bottles old and rent and bound up, and old shoes and clouded upon their feet, and old garments upon them, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua unto the camp at Gilgal, and said unto him, and to the men of Israel, We be come from a far country, now therefore make ye a league with us." The Gibeonites in verse 3 have learned about Israel's conquest of Jericho and Ai, and in verse 4 the people work willily. What does this mean? The people knew that if they tried to destroy Israel in battle, that they would be destroyed themselves. The people knew about God's command to Moses that the promised land would be theirs, and they did not want to lose their lives. So they worked willily, which means they were very clever in their deception. They then sent ambassadors to the Israelites to make a treaty with the Israelites. Since Israel, under God's command, could not enter into a treaty with the people in the land of Canaan, the ambassadors for Gibeon were clever and made their appearance and supplies look as if they had been traveling for a while. The people placed worn-out bags of sackcloth on the backs of their donkeys. The wine bottles were not made of glass, as you may think, but actually the skin of the beast of the field, which when the wineskins got older, the skins would begin to tear and burst. The wineskins would need to be repaired, and they'd often patch holes and tears with new leather. The clothes the people wore had many holes in them, making it appear as if they had traveled for a while. The bread they took was moldy and dry, making it look old from a long journey. The ambassadors from Gibeon arrived at the Israelites' encampment at Gilgal. The people then lied to the Israelites, saying that they are from a far country. But the Israelites were concerned about where these people may actually come from. They even asked the people, "Peradventure ye dwell among us, and how shall we make a league with you?" Which means that they had some suspicion over where the nation of these people was located. If they were one of the 7 nations close by, the people of Israel could not make a league with or treaty with them. The ambassadors said, "We are thy servants," not because they wanted to be Joshua's servants, but because they were saying this out of humility. They were willing to do anything so that they could join Israel. Joshua was cautious, however, and suspected them of being from Canaan, so he asked them where they were from. The ambassadors answered Joshua's question with a lie, saying they were from a very far country. They spoke of Egypt, Heshbon, and Bashan, because if they had mentioned Ai or Jericho, which were recent victorious battles by the Israelites, then it would have seemed very suspicious, since news would not travel that fast in this ancient world. The Gibeonites claimed that their elders had instructed them to make a league with Israel, and that they had taken bread hot from the oven on the day they left. It was now dry and moldy. Also, they said their bottles of wine were filled at the beginning of their journey, but were now worn and useless. This contributed to a very convincing story. This is the verse out of the whole chapter we can learn from the most. The people of Israel, seeing the false evidence the Gibeonites presented, made peace with the Gibeonites. However, verse 14 shows where they really went wrong. Joshua and Israel trusted in their own judgment and did not seek God's wisdom. This caused them to go against Moses' commandments in Deuteronomy 7. The treaty seems to have been made the same day the Gibeonites met with Israel, because the longer they stayed in Israel without making the treaty, the bigger chance they had of being discovered. The Israelites discovered that the Gibeonites were their neighbors and journeyed to the cities Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath-jearim. Gibeon seemed to have been the metropolis. The other 3 cities seemed to be subject to Gibeon. Since they had sworn by the word of the Lord not to smite the Gibeonites, they didn't smite them. The Israelites could not break their oath, even though the other party obtained it out of fraud. According to Leviticus 19:12, "Ye shall not swear by my name falsely, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord." However, just because the Gibeonites' lives were spared does not mean that they were without punishment. The people of Israel demanded that they be Israel's servants for their deception. Joshua called the ambassadors to come before him and asked why they deceived him. He didn't understand their motives as to why they would lie and say they didn't dwell near them. Joshua told them that they would now be the servants of Israel as punishment. "Hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God." This only service they mention here because it was their principal and most durable servitude, being first in the tabernacle and then in the temple, where they were called temple assistants, whereas their servitude to the whole congregation would in a great measure cease when the Israelites were dispersed into their several habitations. Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard about Israel's conquest of Jericho and Ai. He also heard about the league made between the Gibeonites and the Israelites. The king and his people were very frightened because Gibeon was a great city and had very mighty men. The king of Jerusalem could have also been frightened of more nations making treaties with the Israelites, although this would not be likely, since the king, like the Gibeonites, most likely knew that Israel did not accept treaties with those inside Canaan. The king of Jerusalem summoned the other kings whose positions were threatened by Gibeon's association with Israel, and asked them to come up unto me. He said this because the other nations seemed to be in the lowlands, while Jerusalem was in the hills of Judea. The king does not plan on attacking Israel, but instead Gibeon as a form of punishment for making a league with Israel. Here are some reasons why they wanted to go to war with Israel, or Gibeon. They did not want the strength of Gibeon on Israel's side. They wanted to discourage other nations from making peace with the Israelites. They may have wanted to seek revenge because of the Gibeonites' treaty. The Gibeonites knew they could not defeat all 5 of the Amorite kings, so they sent out messengers to Joshua asking for Israel's support in battle. Since they were Joshua's servants, the people of Gibeon felt they were entitled to Israel's protection. Joshua didn't seem to go to Gibeon out of love for the people, but instead to honor the agreement between the Israelites and the Gibeonites. It was also an opportunity to destroy 5 of the Israelites' enemies at once. Joshua consulted the Lord, probably because he had learned that it's a bad idea not to consult the Lord because of what happened earlier. And the Lord told him to fear not, because the Lord would deliver the 5 kings and the combined army into his hand. The Israelites' arrival must have surprised the Amorites in battle because they were not expecting the Israelites to come aid the Gibeonites in battle. This is hinted from the word suddenly in verse 9. The Amorite army was terrified by the sudden and unexpected presence of Israel. They attacked and chased the Amorite army. There was a great loss of life for the Amorites that day. Those who were not killed at Gibeon fled to Beth Horon, Zakah, and Makkedah. These lands would later be Judah. Large hailstones started to rain down on the Amorites, which caused massive amounts of Amorites to die. In fact, more Amorites died from the hailstones than from the sword of the Israelites, according to verse 11. Joshua prays to the Lord for the sun and moon to stand still until his victory over the Amorites is complete. We will come back to this part later for a detailed explanation of the long day. The book of Jasher is believed to have been the book of wars stated in Numbers 21:14. Now we will go into a detailed explanation of Joshua's long day. Many scholars and critics of the Bible try to interpret what the sun stood still really meant. Some say it was a lunar or solar eclipse, but I don't believe it was at all, and here's my reasoning. Lunar and solar eclipses have been studied, and people see them on certain occasions. However, Joshua 10:14 states, "And there was no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord hearkened unto the voice of a man, and the Lord fought for Israel." This verse clearly shows that the sun standing still never happened before and was never to be repeated. Since we have solar eclipses and lunar eclipses to this day, it cannot be described in Joshua 10. Many say this happened again in Hezekiah's day, but the sun was tilted 10 degrees backward on the dial of Ahaz. It is not certain whether those degrees were hours, half hours, or quarters of an hour. The best interpretation is that the sun actually stood still. This would allow Joshua's forces, who gained the upper hand, to continue the battle and gain a complete victory. Those who say this would cause catastrophes around the world don't realize that if there's a God who can tell the sun to stand still in the sky, God can certainly hold back any catastrophes from happening. Now we will go into the Israelites' victory over the Amorites. The kings were not killed by hailstones or killed by the sword of the Israelites. It seems that God saved them for a more shameful end. The kings fled to a cave near Makkedah. It was not in Makkedah, but in one of the hills near Makkedah, since the city was not controlled by Israel. Their armies were dead, so they fled to a cave in the mountains. Joshua was told either by his own men or the inhabitants that the kings were in that cave. Joshua, with this information, commands his men to roll a stone over the mouth of the cave so that they will not escape until he had a convenient time to have the kings brought before them for their demise. So Joshua then, after the cave was sealed, tells his men to not stay at the cave but instead pursue the enemy. The warriors were commanded not to let the enemy retreat to their cities for temporary protection. Joshua encourages his men by telling them that the Lord has delivered them into their hands. The rest of Joshua's army continued to pursue the Amorites while it seems Joshua was encamped at Makkedah. Joshua's army returned to the cave at Makkedah. When they had destroyed the fleeing army, in verse 21, it seems that no one cursed the Israelites. The inhabitants were terrified of Israel and their God, that they did not speak ill of them. Joshua orders his men to open the cave by rolling away the stones and bring out the 5 Amorite kings. The 5 kings were mentioned by name and brought before Joshua for judgment. Joshua orders his captains to place their feet upon the necks of the 5 kings. This symbolized victory, superiority, and promised assurance of future conquest. In verse 25, Joshua once again encourages men by stating that they need to have faith that God will put Israel's enemy into Israel's control. Joshua then smote the Amorite kings, either by his own sword or the sword of his men that he ordered to kill them. He then hanged the kings on trees to shame and disgrace them. This also was a warning to other nations that their God was the one true God. They were hanged on the trees until evening. Then Joshua orders his men to take the kings off the trees before the sun came down. He had to take them down before the day was over, according to Deuteronomy 21:23, which states, "His body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he is hanged, is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance." After they had been taken down from the trees, Joshua's men cast the king's body into the caves they had hidden. What had been their hiding place was now their grave. Joshua's men then rolled a stone over the mouth of the cave for a couple reasons. 1, to prevent the carcasses from being dragged out and eaten by wild animals. 2, to prevent them from being buried again in a more honorable manner. The stone remained there until this very day, meaning it was still there when Joshua grew old and wrote this book. This was the final victory during the Battle of Gibeon. However, in the rest of chapter 10, Joshua does lead a campaign into southern Canaan and conquers many strategic cities. Now we will come to when Saul son of Kish breaks the treaty between the Gibeonites and the Israelites. It seems about 400 to 500 years have passed since the treaty between the Gibeonites and Israelites had been signed. Most resources state that 440 to 480 years have passed. The events take place in 2 Samuel 21 and don't follow chronologically from the chapters before and after this one. God sent a famine over Israel during the reign of King David. David inquired or asked the Lord why he had sent a famine over the land, to which the Lord responded that the famine was sent because Saul had broken the treaty between the Israelites and Gibeonites recorded in Joshua 9. So David therefore asked the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you, that they may bless the inheritance of God?" Because Saul had broken the oath, this puts all of Israel out of a favorable relationship with God. David is asking the Gibeonites what he must do to atone for the sin of Saul committed, so that they may be blessed again. Saul oppressed the Gibeonites, and so they asked for David to hand 7 of Saul's sons over to them that they may be hanged. King David did hand over 7 of Saul's sons, sparing Mephibosheth, since David made a promise to be kind to Jonathan's descendants in 1 Samuel 20. Some believe this was a harsh act for David to do, but there's actually 2 reasons why this wasn't a harsh act. In the first verse of 2 Samuel 21, it states, "It is for Saul and for his bloody house." This could definitely mean that Saul wasn't the only one breaking the oath between the Israelites and Gibeonites, but actually parts of his own family were breaking the oath as well. The other logical reason was because of the corporate responsibilities for the families, meaning that the whole family was held accountable for all actions committed by just one person in the family. The Gibeonites had the men hanged before the Lord. These people were pagans and did not follow the law stated in Deuteronomy 21:22 through 23. It seems they waited for God's approval, which would be evident by rain, therefore ending the famine. In conclusion, the treaty between the Israelites and the Gibeonites, although obtained by fraud, was not meant to be broken according to the law. This brought Israel advantages as read in Joshua 10 during the Battle of Gibeon, where they were able to destroy 5 Amorite nations in one battle, but also serious disadvantages like the famine in 2 Samuel 21. Miracles like the sun standing still and hailstones falling from the sky made it evident to the Canaanite nations that God was in authority and favored the Israelites. Thus, this concludes the study of the Gibeonites in the Bible. To receive a PDF of the whole document and the study, please DM Bible in Context on Instagram. Thank you and have a blessed day.